So, to finish off this series on prehistory, I'd like to look finally at Noah's Ark. Now, the world that we're talking about, as you now know, is a world where you've got a bubble around the world, around the globe, so therefore no seasons and no weather and no rain, and also you've got a small ocean and a large amount of dry land in the continent. Okay, so it's a very different world from the world that we are used to and that we take for granted at this point. And it's into this world that Noah is asked to make a boat, build a boat. And it's quite remarkable. Now, let's have a look and see what it is that he's asked to make. It's very important to go back to the Bible and find the facts, because often people sneer and scoff at the idea, but what they've got in mind is a Sunday school picture, and they're disproving a Sunday school picture. They're not disproving the Bible. And when you look at the Bible, he's told to make something which is about 500 feet long and 50 feet high. Now that's 10 times the length of its height. And it's only 75 feet wide, which is only 1.5 times its width as its height. Okay, so when you think about it, it's a totally different shape. It's not a round bottom boat as portrayed in the Sunday school picture. In fact, it's something more akin to this. Okay, so you're talking about something like an oil tanker, and that's a little bit of a shock to the system for many people. They think, oh, I didn't think it was that shape. Well, that's how it is. And the thing is that, you see, that's what you've actually got to consider if you're going to try and disprove the Bible. Now, also, it's interesting that the word ark is used. The Hebrew word is tevat, and it's also used in Exodus for the basket that Moses is put into. And there it's clearly a basket. It's made of gomeh wood. Moses' basket is coated with pitch in the same way as Noah's Ark is. Noah is told to make it of gopher, and we don't know what gopher is, as opposed to gomer, which is what Moses is made of. So it might have been made of different materials, but nevertheless it's described as a basket, and so therefore if Moses was in a basket, then it's reasonable to see that Noah may have used the same construction. And so I have in mind something akin to this, something long and thin made like a basket. Obviously it's scaled up, it's 450 feet long, so it wouldn't be made of the same materials as you see here, which is reeds. I would imagine that the uprights would be something like tree trunks, pine like telegraph poles, something big, something strong. But it would, once it was coated in pitch, create a totally different construction from that which is traditionally portrayed. It's always portrayed as being made of thick oak, like a ship, because people painted portrayals of the ark according to what they had seen in their own local harbour or port. But if it was 450 feet long, you could not make it of oak. It would just be too rigid, and it would snap as soon as it hit a wave. It would bend under its own weight, and it would just splinter and fall apart. But a basket is flexible, and so you're talking about a totally different idea, because the whole thing is that it's not a boat. It's actually a life raft. It's like a dinghy. It's just meant to float. You'll notice that he's not told to give it sails or a rudder or a bow. It doesn't have to cut through the waves because it's not going anywhere. It's just bobbing along. It's just got to float. And in fact, it will float in the water. It would sink down into the water, so you'd only see a thin profile just above the water. You wouldn't see much of it up above the level of the water up in the air. And so therefore, it's a totally different mindset from that of a ship. It's a life raft, and so therefore you're talking about a basket that's coated in pitch. It's flexible, it's long, and it's not going anywhere. It's just staying where it is. All it's got to do is stay afloat and keep the animals alive. It hasn't got to reach a destination. And so therefore, straight away you see that this is totally different from perhaps the traditions that we've been fed. Now, there are a few contenders as to where Noah's Ark might have been. I mean, we're told that it landed somewhere in Turkey. The name Ararat is mentioned, but it doesn't actually necessarily mean it's on that mountain, which is called Ararat today. Somewhere in that region, somewhere in that vicinity in Turkey. And in Turkey there are some contenders. This is one of the prime contenders for the remains of Noah's Ark. A couple of thousand years ago there were people who wrote about Noah's Ark being a place that pilgrims would go to and visit, like a tourist attraction. So of course, after another couple of thousand years, it's not surprising to see that it's broken down a little bit if this is it. And I'm not convinced that it really is, but there is some evidence. For example, it's about the right size when you measure it on Google Earth. It's about 500 feet long, which would fit the description. It has got a point on it, though, I notice, even though I'm not sure why it would have to have a point. But it's also possible, and you have to be realistic and critical in your thinking, it's possible that this is formed by geological processes. When glaciers pass by, or when mudslides happen, when avalanches happen, when earthquakes happen, and I'm not saying that any of those things has formed this, I'm just saying they do leave strange formations in the ground. After all, what about those other ridges which you can also see in this picture? What formed those? So it's not necessarily Noah's Ark. However, there are some odd things in it. For example, there are some titanium traces been found in this, and now titanium, you'll say, oh, that's a modern alloy, so it must be something modern. Well, there are some people who have said, oh, well, a plane must have crashed here, but there's no evidence of the wreckage apart from this, and how did these get so embedded so deep underground without the rest of the structure being there, but what's interesting is that from a biblical point of view, of course, if you read Genesis 4, you find that there were workers of iron before the flood. So if they had advanced metals before the flood, remembering that man was not primitive before the flood, he was sophisticated according to the Bible, then there's no reason to suppose that Noah wouldn't have used that in the ark. Of course, after the flood, that knowledge may have been lost. If Noah didn't know how to smelt ore to get metal, then presumably that would be lost, or maybe not, we don't know. But the thing is that there's evidence there that there was something strange here, but it does fit the biblical pattern because the Bible says there was iron before the flood, so it's not a problem to us. Also, of course, actually they've scraped back some of this. Unfortunately, a lot of this was done by a chap called Ron Wyatt, who was a lovely guy, but and he was an amateur archaeologist, and I say amateur not to be patronising, because often the professionals are bound by evolutionary thinking, and at least Ron was open-minded, and so he just said it as it was, but he didn't always document his digs properly, or document what he found properly, and so therefore it kind of undermines the integrity of whatever he might have found. But this looks like some uprights. That would fit the idea that it was a basket. You've got uprights, which are tree trunks, and then you've got something that's interwoven in between, which has since rotted away. One would expect some of the pitch to be left. I'm not sure exactly what he found, but it's interesting. That doesn't look like a normal rock formation, and that was dug when they dug away at the bank around the outside, and so there is something that points towards it, and many people believe that this was Noah's Ark. I'm not totally convinced, but it's a possibility. Also in that area you find these anchor stones. They've got a round hole in the top for a rope to go through or to jam in, and these big anchor stones. The carvings on them, the markings on them, are not significant. They've been put there by pilgrims being religious, and they've put all sorts of marks in it. They would not be there originally, as far as we know. So there is some evidence around that area that maybe Noah did actually end up on that particular place. Okay, so looking at the flood, we've got the water in one place, and then down comes the bubble as the bubble is burst, and you end up with 3/4 of the planet being underwater, and you're left with one area which we will call Pangaea. Okay, and that confirms what the Bible says, because the land was all in one place. And we need to bear in mind, however, that the continents were not formed by the flood, as far as I can make out. Maybe there was some splitting of the continent, but as such it says that the earth was divided in 10:25, Genesis 10 verse 25, and so therefore that's where you see the map as we know it, the continents as we know it, being formed. And you can see within Pangaea, you can see where Africa split away from America, and they fit back together again like a jigsaw. Now it's interesting that in previous decades or centuries, then the idea that the continents were once together was scoffed at by mainstream archaeology and geology, and yet now it's just accepted as a normal fact. It's just basic knowledge. Everybody knows that, and it is well accepted. But it's interesting because it confirms the Bible, and it's interesting. The more that people discover in science, the more they find evidence that the Bible is true, and I think that's marvellous. The other thing is about the speed at which these pass away from each other. It's often portrayed as being over millions of years, very, very, very slow. But actually, since they've been mapped in the last few decades, especially with satellites, they found that actually they're moving extremely quickly. And really, you can only account for about a few thousand years, which is quite heartwarming when you're a Bible believer and you've been saying that the whole world has only been here for about 6,000 years. It's marvellous to see geography proving the Bible true. Okay, because actually geographical events happen with startling rapidity. When there are earthquakes, land masses move yards, not millimeters, and it's quite remarkable. After the flood, of course, the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham and Japheth, spread out, and it's interesting that from there, according to the Bible, you can see where they go. They're actually described, and actually you find out that the sons of Japheth went to the north towards Europe and also towards Asia. They spread out, and also the sons of Ham went down towards Africa, and the sons of Shem were mainly in the Middle East. And it's interesting that those areas represent also the ethnic diversity of the world's population. Now, if man was primitive a few thousand years ago, as archaeologists or evolutionists, I should say, have us believe, then they wouldn't have known who was on the other continents, because they would never have seen much further than their own backyard. The thing is that actually what we see in the ethnic diversity of the world's population is actually something that backs up the Bible, because the sons of Javan or Japheth are in Europe, and that's largely where you get Caucasians. The sons of Ham went down to Africa, and that's where you get the Africans. And then of course you've got the Semitic peoples, which is the Arabs, the Jews and the people associated with them, and they are the Semitic peoples, and they're the Middle Eastern peoples. And it's interesting, when you look at archaeology, you find more and more evidence of this. Okay, so for example, in the statues in Egypt, you see very much that the sons of Ham or Mizraim had African features. Okay, now the Egyptians of today, the people called Egyptians, are actually Semitic peoples. They're Arabs. They're very different. The sons of Ham were driven out by the Arabs, and so they're down in Africa. And it's interesting that in those paintings from 3,000 years ago, you see that the Semitic peoples are portrayed with yellow skin, and the sons of Ham are portrayed with dark skin. And so you can see how those ethnic features, those distinguishing features, were already developing in those days, in the centuries after the flood. Because if the flood was only 4,000 years ago, then that's only a few generations after. And it's rather marvellous to see how actually the Bible is proven true once again. So that brings us to the end of the prehistory. We've looked at things up to the flood and the earth being divided, and so now we're getting into the generations that lead up to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and history as we know it. Of course, that's only the first dozen or so chapters of Genesis, and when you actually consider that, then you actually begin to realize that we've only covered a small amount of the Bible, and yet we've actually covered about a third of world history. So it's a big subject. There's a lot of information in there, but it's only compressed into a few chapters in the Bible. And as we go on, we're going to look at the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. We'll look at their background, and we'll see how it fits in with what we've seen so far, the the population of the world expanding exponentially, just off the scale from Shem, Ham and Japheth, and how quickly they took over the planet, and the fantastic things that they did, leading up to, for example, the Tower of Babel, where they thought that they could build a skyscraper way beyond anything that we can build today. And so therefore they were not primitive peoples, they were sophisticated, and we will see evidence of that as we look at the archaeology. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be off to prepare my stuff on Abraham and beyond. Bless you all.